You're a sight for sore eyes. Hi. I hope you're having a nice day. Thank you for joining me on this drive again. I know it takes you a bit out of your way, but I really appreciate you being here. Now, while I'm driving, there's 3 things I can do for you. I can quiet down and let you listen to the sounds of the road, or I can play some records for you. Some records I set up that I think would go nicely with this occasion. But I could also tell you a story. Well, the choice is yours. I'll leave these options laid out in front of you. I'll be happy with whatever you choose. I'm just glad you came to visit today. I think these times when we drive might be calming you down, and I'm glad to see that you're a little less stressed. If you're still here, I'll assume that you'd like to hear a story. And today I'm going to tell you about Joel and dyslexia. Take a break. I don't know, but I think you deserve a moment without stress. Let's get started. You may not know this, but I was 5 when my older brother left for the army. I had grown up mostly without my father, and until then, Milton, my older brother, he played that role. He and my mother didn't always get along too well. They had a falling out when he was 16. So before he was old enough to buy a car, Milton joined the army and went off to Vietnam. I didn't know how they allowed him to get in while he was 16, but knowing him, he probably lied about his age and forged some documents. He was smart enough to do that. But after that day he left, I didn't see him for a long time. Milton did return home when the war was over, but he was never the same. He was a changed man. That is, he came back to the United States, but his mind was still a military man. I saw him every now and then for holidays. Years later, he settled down with his wife, he got married, and then he had Joel. I guess that makes Joel my nephew. Sometimes it still sets in that I'm an uncle. Reminds me how old I am. It wasn't until 2 years later that I actually got to meet Joel, though. When I got to meet Joel, I was actually the age my brother was when he left for the army. Joel was a little boy, and when I met him, he was in striped pajamas. When I met him at that time, I just thought he was a good kid, very peaceful. I didn't get to know him too well until like a decade later. At this time, I'd had my own family. I had been told that Joel had significant trouble trying to read. His parents were worried about him. When he was in the 3rd grade, he was still reading at a 1st grade level, and back then, people weren't as understanding and accepting, so the words used to describe Joel weren't nice, and they weren't helpful, to be frank. About 6 months later, he was put into a special education class. His parents didn't understand the trouble he was having. They just told him to study harder and that he'd improve if he put in the work. He hated reading because it was such a long process for him, and all the aura surrounding reading became so negative, for him at least. But looking back, no one would have suspected that later he would become interested in being a journalist. Joel was about 10 when he was diagnosed with dyslexia. It's a language processing disorder, and I've known other people that have it. He had a lot of trouble distinguishing between letters and shapes, and because of that, it took him much longer to read. Even though this severely limited what he could do, his parents were relieved because To them, this meant that it wasn't a matter of intelligence. It was something that necessarily wasn't in his control. Nonetheless, Joel was incredibly intelligent, very bright boy. Joel had no interest in reading until sometime in middle school. Joel had no interest in reading until his time in middle school. At this time, Joel started to read comic books. He liked having the pictures to look at instead of words. It helped with his comprehension. He started out with very easy comic books and soon got interested in more mature comic books. Books that had more text to them is what I mean. This caused him to read a lot, surprisingly. For a time, he realized that reading was something that he not only had to do, but that he wanted to do. Even though it took a lot of time, he started to read more often. First his comic books, then books, then newspapers, and before long he was a reader. He started reading whatever he could. His eyes got accustomed to the words and, well, I'd like to think that his reading improved drastically. When high school came around, Joel had a tough time keeping up with the curriculum. With so many books required to read, he would spend hours every night struggling to keep up. Still, his grades stagnated. He became worried about his studies and that his work, all his hard work, was for nothing. Seeing how much their boy was struggling, his parents hired a tutor. They tried multiple exercises, and slowly, Joel began to improve. Alongside dyslexia exercises, in order to get him through the large amounts of work, Joel made an arrangement with his tutor, who had read all the books before. Joel's tutor would help him identify the parts of the book that were most important, and Joel would read those parts so that he could get through the work a bit more efficiently. To him, though, this felt like cheating. He wasn't reading the whole book, and instead having someone else read for him. Although he wasn't only working. Once he got to college, however, this approach wasn't an option at all. College was a new environment, and Joel didn't have his old tutor. Joel became greatly interested in the newspaper during his later years in high school. At times, he would submit a piece he had written to the school newspaper. Even though he had trouble reading, he had learned to type really well. Usually, he would have someone review his writing before submitting it. In college, he decided to major in journalism. It wasn't an easy major for someone with dyslexia, but it was the only thing Joel was really interested in. With journalism, you can't just have someone read the material for you. You have to pay attention to every single line. And with dozens of articles to read a week, Joel began to have trouble keeping up. He got back on track using a few simple tricks. For one, he took the time to plan out what classes he needed to take early on, and he got another tutor to help him improve his reading. And finally, he just put in a lot of hard work and dedication. He was determined, and thus he worked himself to the bone, reading all the time, staying up late. He missed a lot of parties on the weekend, but he knew what he was working towards. Over 10 years later, Joel became a successful journalist. His work includes reading articles and doing interviews, and, well, he's good at it. When articles started being put online, he was able to put the words into a text-to-speech program too, so that he could listen. Luckily, since his days in school, his dyslexia has improved drastically. He can read much faster, and he doesn't really use the text-to-speech program too often now. And now that he has easy access to keyboards, his handwriting is no longer a big problem. You know, his articles have actually won a few awards. He has quite a unique writing style. And now, He has an editor, so there's someone that catch the occasional spelling mistakes. I got to sit down and talk to him recently, and he loves his job. It's hard sometimes, but it's what he chooses to do. And ironically, he says that it's the only thing he could do. It was his passion. And even though there were things out of his control that made it hard for him, he never gave up on his passion. I don't mean to be cliche, but sometimes, because it was his passion, it was the only thing he could do, no matter what. And because of that, he never gave up. So you know what? I hope that you never give up either. Hey, maybe you'll meet Joel someday. If you keep riding with me. Are you still awake? Nah, it's okay. Have a good night. Make sure to give yourself a break every now and then. I'll see you later.